Ever wanted to learn about every cancelled Sonic the Hedgehog game? Find out in every cancelled Sonic game. Game Facts Special. There are at least 20 cancelled or unreleased Sonic games.
What did he say?
From consoles ranging from the Sega Genesis, Game Boy Advance, and Xbox. And these games range in genre, from mainline platformer to sports titles. We'll be covering all of them in this episode. Sonic Riders GBA port. Sonic Riders is a well-known and much-loved game, but did you know that there was going to be a port to the Game Boy Advance? The console version of the game used a 3D engine, but due to the limitations of the Game Boy Advance system, this was not really feasible for the port. Instead, the development team at Backbone Entertainment worked on an engine which primarily used 2D sprites, similar to the one used in the arcade racing game Outrun. The hoverboarding Hedgehog never made it to the GBA, with complications arising when Sega of Japan demanded more 3D elements, resulting in the American side of the company axing the game, as they'd have to significantly rework the engine to incorporate 3D assets. Sonic Sports. A spin-off game featuring Sonic and his pals was in development for the 32X. This game almost beat Mario in its bid to have the first character-focused console sports spin-off. There are no leaked ROMs, prototypes, or source code for Sonic Sports. The only information we have is an article by the now discontinued Game Players magazine, which claimed that the development team was Scavenger, who was also working on other games for 32X hardware at the time. The article also hinted at an all-in-one 32X and Genesis system that was reportedly going to be called the Sega Neptune. Ultimately, a number of factors likely led to its cancellation, including 32X's poor sales and the fact that development kits for the 32X were released late, not leaving much time for development. Sonic the Hedgehog Awakening. This game was rumored to be in development between the years of 2006 and 2009, with its public discovery happening when keen-eyed Sonic fans found the title of the game on Pete Cabela's work portfolio. Cabela back then was the voice for Silver the Hedgehog, and was presumably hired to voice that character in the game, suggesting that this game was quite far along in its development. It's quite rare for a cancelled Sonic game to have this little info, as fans normally are able to get hold of visuals and concepts of these games, even working source code into playable prototypes. However, there is nothing on Sonic Awakening. Maybe this lack of information suggests that Sonic Awakening was an in-development name for a later Sonic game that did release, such as Sonic and the Secret Rings, or Sonic Riders Zero Gravity. But fans speculate that the game would have centered around Silver, and that it may have been cancelled due to the poor reception of Sonic 06, Silver's debut game. Sonic X-Treme. Possibly the most infamous of the entire range of cancelled Sonic games, and one that will keep cropping up as we go along. Sonic X-Treme was slated to be the next big Sonic game. It was intended to boost sales of the Sega Saturn and time to release for the holiday rush. Several different versions of the Sonic X-Treme project were attempted by Sega of America. But the version that got the farthest was a version developed by Chris Sen and programmer Ofer Allen, who were in charge of making the levels and engine for the game, while a second team, led by Christina Coffin, developed the boss encounters on a separate engine. The two teams worked under the supervision of producer Mike Wallace. A game split into two engines with two separate teams working on it seems like a bad enough idea on its own. But Sega of America executives decided to take it a step further at one point by scrapping the work done on the level engine work for Saturn and bringing in a third-party company called Point of View to take over programming duties starting from scratch. After another poor showing of the level engine, Sega of Japan executives ordered the entire game to be reworked into the boss engine, thus again starting the level portion of the game from scratch. The game's story underwent even more rewrites than the code. At one point, Sega producer Richard Wheeler and game designer Hirokazu Yasuhara pitched the idea of having the game set in space, with Dr. Eggman building a Death Egg to use for his world-conquering plans. The pair planned to have different alien species included in the story, interacting with the Sonic characters. While the story and code went through many iterations, the gameplay style landed upon a spherical fisheye lens, which the player could rotate in order to get better views of the 3D environment that Sonic was in, utilizing the mechanic for puzzle solving and exploration. Many issues led to X-Treme's demise. The game was not being made by the usual Sonic team, instead by the two teams mentioned at the Sega Technical Institution. Relations weren't great between the American and Japanese arms of Sega, leading to stressful work conditions and long hours for a dev team new to working in 3D. The exorbitant expectations from Sega of Japan compounded the problem. This unsustainable work atmosphere led to lead developer Christina Coffin to become sick. Likewise, Chris Sen stepped away from the project for his health. This led Mike Wallace to throw in the towel and cancel Sonic X-Treme. Fan expectations of a brand new 3D Sonic game were destroyed with the cancellation of Sonic X-Treme, arguably affecting the future of Sega's involvement as a console leader. Information about Sonic X-Treme is well preserved. Multiple Saturn and PC prototypes have leaked. At one point during the mid-2000s, Chris Sen hosted a Sonic X-Treme compendium and released tons of game assets, with aspirations of completing the game unofficially by working with fans. That never happened, but there have been several attempts to finish the game. Hopefully one day it will happen, even if only unofficially. Sega Sonic Bros. This cancelled game was one that never graced the arcades. Designed by Bubble Bobble creator Fukio Mitsuji, Sega Sonic's development was actually mostly completed. However, due to poor player response, it never saw the light of day outside of Sega's localization testing. The game followed a similar gameplay structure to the classic Tetris, but rather than falling blocks, it involved differently colored Sonic characters that fell from the top of the screen. The game was designed to have social mechanics with a two-player mode, but ultimately scrapped and never made it out to the public. Sister Sonic. This was a great case of fans getting involved in game development and influencing the course of Sonic history. In 1992, a game called Popful Mail was released in Japan on the MegaCD, known as the Sega CD outside Japan. During this time, and after the success of Sonic 2, Sega joined the development team of Popful Mail and began reskinning the entire game to be Sonic-related. It would be released as Sister Sonic, introducing Sonic's sibling. In 1993, a popular gaming magazine, Electronic Gaming Monthly, reported on Sega's plans, and Popful Mail fans were outraged. They wrote letters to both companies expressing how they wanted Popful Mail in its original form, ultimately causing this Sonic Sister rebrand to be cancelled. After the cancellation of Sister Sonic, publisher Working Designs picked up Popful Mail for a proper Western release to the Sega CD. Sonic Crackers. This game was one of the earliest prototypes of Knuckles Chaotix, but appears here due to its many differences. Sonic and Tails were originally to be the main characters in this game. Fans uncovered the Genesis ROM of this early build in 1995, with much speculation as to whether the game was a joke by the group that made it public. It was later found to be legitimate after other prototypes of Chaotix were uncovered. Like in Chaotix, Sonic and Tails are attached by a bungee ring, probably inspired by the bouncing motion of the kids' toy Clackers. The name Sonic Crackers is actually thought to be a mistranslation of the word clackers due to the lack of the L sound in native Japanese speech. Aside from the character swaps, the special stages are also completely different from Chaotix. While Chaotix had bonus stages, which would shift camera perspective to full 3D, Crackers was intended to have an isometric view during the field stages. It's unknown why or exactly when Sonic and Tails were dropped in favor of Knuckles and the Chaotix, but the earliest Sonic-free prototype we have is from December 7th, 1994. Sonic's one-button mobile game. Intended for release on iOS and Android, Nitrome pitched a Sonic game with mechanics that ended up being used for their game Super Leap Day, which was released in 2021. The developers created a fully fleshed out demo for Sega executives to enjoy. However, according to a tweet by Nitrome, it didn't go down too well. The game was pitched with the idea of being a simple take on their classic games, with just one control button. The developers said that they would have included pinball bonus rounds and stage themes echoing old and new Sonic releases. Nitrome followed up their tweet with a casual hint to Sega that they'd still be down to work on a Sonic game considering their success with Super Leap Day. Maybe one day, Nitrome. Maybe one day. Sonic DS. The Nintendo DS was hot on the market in 2004, and Sega wanted a piece of it. Sega knew they had to make a Sonic game for the hit handheld, and when E3 in 2004 came, work had been completed on a tech demo for the DS. The demo was a 3D runner of sorts, with largely flat level design, negating the need for most jumping. Players would swipe the screen to increase Sonic's speed, utilizing the touchscreen mechanics that the DS was famous for. At the end of the short demo, players were graded on how fast they completed the level and how many rings they collected. The tech demo gathered some impressive responses in regards to the visuals, but ultimately was simplistic in gameplay. This game was eventually swiped aside, and Sonic Rush ended up being the first DS Sonic game. Sonic Mars. This title was in development for the performance-enhancing add-on to the Sega Genesis, the 32X, which held the codename Project Mars, making it clear to see where Sonic Mars got its title. Lead designer Michael Kosaka and a duo of assistants pitched this game to Sega of America to great success. The trio of designers would take heavy inspiration from the Sonic television show that was airing at the time, with ambitions to create the first 3D polygonal Sonic game. Yuji Naka, who was co-creator and president of the Sonic team at the time, reportedly had a negative reaction towards what the American development team had come up with, and backhandedly wished them luck on development, noting their naivety. The 3D scope ended up being too much for even the 32X, and the project moved to the Sega Saturn, where it evolved into Sonic X-Treme. Sonic Saturn. Whilst work was tumultuously commencing on Sonic X-Treme, the Sega Technical Institute were working on another Sonic game that would be released for the Sega Saturn. Not much information about this cancelled game exists, aside from a small amount of concept art, which appears to depict the inclusion of Metal Sonic. Peter Morawiecz, a designer who began his Sonic career making the special stages on Sonic 2, described Sonic Saturn's bonus stages as a mini-game where Sonic would be playing a giant ball game similar to Pool. The screenshots that Morawiecz released shows Sonic being on a table within a 3D environment featuring various themes, including an Egyptian theme, a Roman amphitheater, and even a futuristic spaceship stage. This project was eventually cancelled, and Morawiecz went on a mission spanning years to get his bonus stage design into a Sonic game. The Sonic X-Treme team agreed during one of their phases of development, but we all know how that went. Sonic the Hedgehog MicroPCs. Yes, that's correct. The classic original Genesis game was being ported to European MicroPCs. At the time, Sega had lucrative contracts licensing out its arcade intellectual properties to publishers in the European home computer industry, including games like World Cup Soccer, Outrun, and Thunderblade. Prior to the expansion of success that Sega had with Sonic, they were ready to sign off on deals which would bring the Blue Hedgehog to home computer systems too. Once Sonic was a system-selling success, Sega didn't want to disrupt the flow of customers that would come to buy the Mega Drive or Master System purely to play Sonic the Hedgehog, so they decided to pull out of negotiations with would-be publishers. It's unlikely much, if any, work was actually completed on these ports. But we can speculate that ports would have been likely for ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, the Amiga, and Atari ST. Sonic the Hedgehog MegaCD. Continuing with the theme, another port of the original game was cancelled. To be titled Sonic the Hedgehog MegaCD, this port would take advantage of the add-on hardware systems that Sega was developing, the MegaCD. The new hardware would boast enhanced graphics and processing power. Details of the game have been seen in public twice, first with a tech demo at the Consumer Electronics Show during the summer of 1992, and as a feature in the 11th issue of the Mega Play magazine. As development progressed, the game either evolved into or was cancelled in favor of an entirely new game, Sonic the Hedgehog CD, which extended the original game's mechanics with time travel and introduced new characters, Amy Rose and Metal Sonic. Sonic the Hedgehog 2 CD. The timeline of events surrounding Sonic 1 Mega CD's change for Sonic CD is unclear. It's further complicated because we know at one point Sonic 2 was also planned for the Mega CD. While in development, Sonic 2 CD may have gone by the names Super Sonic or Sonic the Hedgehog 2 Escape from Ring Zone. Some believe that Sonic 2 and Sonic CD split into two distinct games when Yuji Naka left Japan for Sega of America, but it's difficult to know. Others speculate that Sonic CD may have taken abandoned ideas from this Sonic 2 CD port. What we know for sure is that Sega of America was advertising a version of Sonic 2 for the Sega CD in 1992. Sonic the Hedgehog 3 Limited Edition. The story of this title begins with the simultaneous development of Sonic & Knuckles and Sonic 3 for the Sega Genesis, as these two games were initially planned as one game. Due to the tight deadlines, the cost of large enough cartridges, and marketing obligations that came with a McDonald's promotional deal, the developers had to split the game in two. The limited edition, also known as Sonic 3 Plus or Sonic 3 Complete, was to hold both games on the same cartridge. Two early prototypes of this game were found, and unfortunately, this game was cancelled. This was likely decided in order to save development resources once Sega had created their lock-on technology, which allowed players to plug in their Sonic 3 cartridge into the Sonic & Knuckles lock-on system. Doing this allowed for additional content for both games, including altered levels, new playable characters, Tails and Knuckles respectively, and also the inclusion of the new collectibles and abilities. Sonic the Hedgehog X-Treme. Not to be confused with the famous X-Treme that we've already mentioned, Sonic the Hedgehog X-Treme was planned to show off the Blue Hedgehog's hoverboarding skills. Slated for release on the Xbox, it would feature Sonic and Shadow riding around a 3D open-world version of Green Hill, including different game modes. Due to the popularity of the Pro Skater games, developers at Visionscape Interactive saw an opportunity to pair skate culture with Sonic the Hedgehog's gnarly attitude. An early prototype was found and subsequently released online in 2016. Some believe that it may have been this prototype which led to the game Sonic Riders, leaving Visionscape's co-founder Mark McDonald a bit bitter, as he claimed that Sega took their concept to make the hoverboarding game, though no legal action was taken due to contractual obligations that McDonald signed while working on the Sonic IP. Sonic's Edusoft. Developed by Tiertex Design Studios, this cancelled game would have seen Sonic in an educational game that was due to be released for the Sega Master System in 1991. If released, then this would have made it not only the first educational Sonic game, but also the first Sonic game made by an outside company. With over 15 levels, the game featured timed puzzles, with correct answers moving Sonic along in a race-themed map. Unfortunately for Tiertex, they never obtained the license for the Sonic IP and couldn't release the game. Multiple sprites and even a prototype have been leaked online by fans. Sonic 16. Peter Morawiecz returns for this cancelled game, where he and his colleague, John Duggan, at the Sega Technical Institute pitched a game that would have strong narrative elements based on the animated Sonic TV show that aired on ABC at the time, known as Sonic Sat AM. Sonic 16 would be developed for the Genesis, with beat-em-up styled game mechanics, new abilities for Sonic, such as ledge climbs, and new attacks. A video demonstration exists of the game, which displays fully animated sprites with a visual style that appears to be a vast departure from previous games. Sonic 16 was cancelled personally by Yuji Naka, with speculation that the slower gameplay didn't have him convinced. Treasure Tales. Game designers who worked for the Sega Technical Institute in 1993 pitched a spin-off Sonic game starring Tails. The game would have had an isometric view of various tomb areas, with screenshots depicting Tails exploring these ruins. Very little is known about this project, aside from the screenshots released by Craig Stitt, who made the screenshots in order to make a more appealing and persuasive presentation. Stitt rediscovered them on a VHS in 2020 and uploaded them onto a private Facebook group revolving around retro Sega games. It's unknown whether the pitch was approved, but the game was definitely never made. Untitled Sega Technical Institute game. There is one game that STI employee Chris Sen created concept art for that never got a name. The image that Sen made showed Sonic in a world with graphics similar to the older classics, but with an isometric view. The paths are diverging, but only momentarily, making it seem like Sen wanting to hold on to the classic mechanics, but update the player's viewpoint. Sen himself said that the mock-up screenshot was made during the development of the 32X hardware, with him keeping in mind the possibilities that this could bring to development. The concept for this game never came to fruition, and that it was absorbed and ultimately lost in the many iterations of Sonic X-Treme. Astropede. After the development of Sonic Spinball, Sega Technical Institute's Craig Stitt and Ken Rose developed a game for the Genesis. It starred a robotic centipede named Zip that would grow and shrink in size when taking damage. At first, the game was to be a spin-off of the Sonic series, with the Zip character intended to be a creation of Dr. Robotnik. The game would have reused graphics from Sonic 2's cancelled Hidden Palace Zone. After 14 months of development, the game was cancelled to focus on STI's other games, Comics Zone and The Ooze. There was also a planned Sonic Triple Trouble release for the Master System, according to the UK magazine Sega Power. And there was even a version of Sonic Generations that was going to make its way to the Sony PlayStation Portable. We know this from a development UMD found by video game preservationists. But we'll talk about that one real soon. Thanks to Kieran Cosway and Overbound for writing this episode. Make sure to like the video and subscribe. This has been a GameFAQs special.